The smell of roast chicken filled the room as Ben, my grandson, smirked and said, "Old people eat last." Still, I didn't flinch, only tightened my grip on my fork. As his words echoed through the room, I felt the years of disrespect and neglect from him pile up. While the rest of the family remained silent, pretending not to hear, I realized I'd let this go on for far too long. That's when I stood up, my voice calm but final. "Ben, you'll eat last now. In fact, you'll eat outside." All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The smell of roast chicken and fresh vegetables filled the air, the hum of quiet chatter threading through the evening as the Morgan family gathered around the dining table. The overhead light cast a soft glow on the scene. Helen, at the head of the table, her face weathered yet strong, as she served herself a modest portion. The rest of the family settled in, an uneasy calm hanging over them as they took their seats. The kids were absent tonight, a rarity, leaving the adults to themselves. Ben, sitting at the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His 22 years felt heavy in the air tonight, as though he were trying to pull the attention towards himself, as he always did. His eyes flitted over the food before him, then back up to his grandmother, who was quietly dishing out plates with practiced ease. Ugh, old people always eat last, don't they? Ben's voice sliced through the low murmur of conversation like a knife, a hint of mockery dripping from his words. His gaze was fixed on Helen, his smirk wide as he waited for her reaction. For the reaction of everyone else in the room. The table fell into an awkward silence. Clara, seated next to Helen, glanced down at her plate, avoiding eye contact with anyone. David, her husband, cleared his throat and took a long drink from his glass, as though trying to dissolve the tension with the alcohol. Neither of them said a word. Helen's hand froze mid-air, her spoon hovering over her plate. She could feel the weight of Ben's words like a slap, the sting of disrespect that rang louder than anything else in the room. She glanced at Clara, seeking her daughter's support, but found only averted eyes. No one was ready to challenge Ben, not here, not now. But Helen was not someone who let things like this slide. She knew that if she reacted immediately, the storm would only grow. So, she pressed her lips together, her breath steadying as she placed her spoon back on the table, taking a moment to regain composure. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, measured, too calm. "Ben," she said softly, her eyes lifting to meet his. "I think you might want to consider what you're saying before you speak. It's not polite." Ben laughed, a harsh, biting laugh that rang in the room like a challenge. "Polite? Grandma, we're family. Who cares about being polite?" Helen's fingers tightened around the edge of her plate, the delicate china creaking under the pressure. Her jaw set in a way that only those who knew her well would recognize. It was the unmistakable expression of someone holding back a storm. But inside, there was a quiet fury building, one she could no longer ignore. She could feel the years of small insults like this one collecting, a quiet pile of neglect and disrespect she had allowed to build over time. Clara looked from her mother to her son, her face pinched with frustration but silent. David shifted in his seat, uncomfortable, unwilling to make waves, unsure of how to navigate this conversation. Neither of them wanted to be the first to step in. Helen didn't need them. She didn't need anyone to validate her feelings. It was time. Time for this nonsense to stop. Ben leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the unease he had stirred. He took a bite of his food, still smirking as though he were the victor in this little game, oblivious to the deepening fracture he was creating within the family. "I guess the old folks have to wait for the young ones to get their fill first, huh?" he taunted, eyes glinting. "I mean, isn't that how it goes?" Helen looked at him, her gaze unwavering now. The moment of hesitation passed, replaced by something deeper. A resolve that had been quietly growing inside her, unnoticed by anyone. She had been patient, forgiving too many times, always dismissing his rudeness, always making excuses. But that was over now. Her voice, though calm, cut through the room like a thunderclap. Ben, this will be the last time you speak to me like that. Do you understand? Ben faltered, the edge in her voice pulling him up short, but he quickly recovered. What? You're going to give me some old-school lecture about respect? Save it, Grandma. But Helen didn't flinch. She didn't need to defend herself. She had spent a lifetime accommodating others, bending herself to make things easier for those around her. But this was different. She wasn't going to be the one to take the hit anymore. She wasn't going to allow herself to be disrespected by anyone in her own house, least of all her own grandson. I'm not going to beg you for respect, she said, her voice low but fierce. You will learn it, or you will leave. This is your last warning. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Ben's eyes widened slightly, his usual bravado flickering for a fraction of a second. The others around the table exchanged nervous glances, but none of them spoke. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for Ben's next move. And for the first time in a long while, Helen felt a quiet strength settle inside her. This was the moment. She had drawn the line. Ben leaned forward, eyes narrowing, trying to gauge if his grandmother was bluffing. You can't be serious, he muttered. But this time, his voice lacked its usual edge. Helen didn't respond. She simply picked up her fork and began eating her meal in quiet defiance, the calm that had settled over her a stark contrast to the storm swirling in Ben's eyes. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as the family continued to eat, the tension now a permanent guest at their table. Helen knew that this moment would change things. She could feel it. Ben's days of walking all over her were over. The question now was how far she was willing to go to make him understand. And as the last bite of her meal slid onto her plate, she made a decision that would ripple through everything that came after it. This was the end of the old Helen, the one who tolerated disrespect. The next time Ben crossed her, he would face consequences. The days after the dinner were heavier than Helen had anticipated. The anger she felt, that quiet surge of indignation, had not dissipated with the passing hours. Instead, it had settled into a gnawing discomfort that she couldn't shake. She found herself replaying the moment Ben had spoken, his dismissive words hanging in the air over and over, like a song stuck on repeat. Each time she tried to shake it off, the memory would resurface, biting at the edges of her thoughts. She couldn't focus at work, couldn't enjoy her walks in the park, not when the echoes of Ben's voice, "Old people eat last," seemed to ring in her ears. Clara noticed the change. It had been almost a week, and Helen still wasn't herself. She hadn't made any mention of the dinner since that night, but there was an unease in the way Helen moved. As if every gesture had been infused with unspoken words, Clara's concern bubbled to the surface one evening when she called her mother. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, cautious, "you've got to let this go. Ben's just being Ben. You know how he is. He doesn't mean anything by it. He's young. He doesn't know any better." Helen, sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where she'd had the confrontation with Ben, stared down at her hands. She hadn't realized how much they were trembling until she noticed the slight quiver in her fingers as she gripped her coffee mug. She took a long sip before responding. "I don't think I can just let it go, Clara." Clara sighed. "Mom, you're making too much of this. He's your grandson. He's a good kid. Just talk to him. Maybe sit down, have a heart-to-heart." But Helen wasn't so sure anymore. The more she thought about it, the more the events of that night seemed like just one chapter in a long pattern of disrespect. It wasn't just the comment about old people eating last, it was how Ben took her presence in the house for granted. How he had made a habit of lounging around, never offering to help with chores, always assuming that someone would take care of things for him. That was the thing that had worn her down over the years. She couldn't remember the last time Ben had done anything for anyone without being asked. Even when he was a child, Helen had been the one running around, making sure his world was perfect, his needs met. And it was as though he had carried that entitlement into adulthood, as though her role was to always bend and accommodate without question. The thoughts swirled like a storm inside her, getting louder, more insistent with each passing hour. The frustration was starting to boil over, but she didn't know what to do with it. Angela called her the next day, sensing something was wrong, as she always did. She was Helen's oldest friend, the kind of person who had no patience for niceties when there was real work to be done. "Something's eating at you, isn't it?" Angela asked bluntly over the phone. "Tell me what's going on." Helen sighed heavily into the receiver, her breath shaky. "It's Ben. He said something, and I can't let it go." Angela's response was immediate, no hesitation. "Good. You shouldn't. You need to set a boundary, Helen. You've been tiptoeing around him for years, trying to keep the peace. But what about your peace?" Helen leaned back in her chair, her heart thudding against her chest. It felt like Angela had just spoken the words Helen hadn't allowed herself to say. "But Clara thinks I'm overreacting," she said quietly. "She thinks I should just forget about it." "Clara isn't the one dealing with the disrespect," Angela shot back, her voice firm, but with the warmth that only a true friend could provide. "You can't let Ben keep walking all over you. And you don't need anyone's permission to take a stand. This is your home, your life." Helen took in the words, feeling them settle deep in her bones. She had spent so many years giving, accommodating, putting everyone else first. All her life, she had sacrificed for her family, sacrificed her own wants and needs, so that they could have what they needed. And yet, here she was, feeling as though she were invisible in her own home. No more. "I've always put them first," Helen said softly, more to herself than to Angela. "But what about me, Angela? When do I get to say enough?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Angela's voice softened. "You've earned the right to be heard. You've earned the right to say enough." Helen closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. The tension had been building for so long, she hadn't realized how deeply it had seeped into her life. It wasn't just Ben, it was the entire dynamic. She had always been the one to swallow the hurt, the one to keep things together, to avoid conflict. But now, every slight, every disrespect, felt like a thread in the tapestry of her life, each one unraveling slowly, quietly, until there was nothing left but a frayed mess. The next few days were difficult. Helen couldn't look at Ben without feeling a surge of frustration. He continued to make his presence known in the house, loud, careless, as if nothing had happened, as though that dinner had been forgotten by everyone but her. He would wander in and out of the kitchen, grabbing snacks and leaving wrappers on the counter, without a second thought. He took up space, used up her time, her patience, yet never seemed to notice the toll it was taking on her. Helen began to feel invisible, the years of putting everyone's needs ahead of her own suddenly catching up to her. How had she let this go on for so long? How had she allowed herself to be taken for granted? To be the silent matriarch, the one who never raised her voice, never made demands? She felt for the first time in years a flicker of something within her. Anger. But also something deeper. Self-respect. A refusal to be dismissed. She was done playing the role of the silent sufferer. And as she stood in her kitchen one afternoon, watching Ben stuff his face with leftovers without so much as a thank you, the decision was made. It was time to act. She had put up with enough. Helen turned on her heel, her heart thundering in her chest, and dialed Angela's number. "I'm going to do it," she said, before Angela could even speak. "I'm going to set the boundary." Angela's voice was warm, approving. "Good. You deserve it." The storm that had been brewing for days finally found its path. The foundation was laid, and nothing would be the same again. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue through the windows of Helen's house. It should have been a peaceful Sunday afternoon, the kind of gathering that usually brought the family together. But today, the air was thick with anticipation, each breath heavier than the last. The family was once again gathered around the table. This time, there were more conversations happening. David, Clara, and Ben sitting across from each other, avoiding the heavy silence that had settled between them. The remnants of an earlier meal sat on the table, forgotten, as everyone seemed too distracted by the palpable tension to continue eating. Ben was, as usual, the first to break the quiet, his sharp voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I don't get why you guys even bother with all this. I mean, look at you two. Acting like the perfect couple, but you're not fooling anyone." He looked at his parents, a smirk playing on his lips, then quickly turned to Helen. "I mean, I guess old people need to feel like they still matter, huh? Gotta keep the family in check, even if it's just for show." The words landed like a slap, every syllable laced with mockery. Helen's breath caught, and for a moment she could feel her hands trembling. She could see Clara's face pale beside her, and David's uncomfortable shift in his chair as he looked away, pretending to study the tablecloth. But it was Ben's eyes, locked onto hers with that same condescending smile, that sparked something deep inside her. Helen's hand gripped the edge of the table, nails digging into the wood as she struggled to hold her composure. This time, there would be no brushing it off. This time, there would be no pretending to be the bigger person. "You've crossed the line, Ben," Helen said, her voice calm but unshakable. The room went still, every eye flicking toward her. Clara's gaze darted to her mother in surprise. David opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure of what to say. Ben laughed, clearly not understanding the gravity in Helen's tone. "Oh, come on, Grandma, you can't be serious. I was just kidding around. You need to lighten up." His voice was dripping with sarcasm, his eyes daring her to rise to the challenge. Helen inhaled deeply, drawing the breath deep into her chest as if she were collecting every ounce of strength she had left. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. "No, Ben. This isn't a joke anymore. This—" She gestured to the space between them, her finger sweeping over the table, the room. "This behavior ends now." Ben opened his mouth to retort, but Helen raised a hand, silencing him with a single, sharp motion. She wasn't finished. "You don't get to walk all over me anymore, and you don't get to treat me, or this family, with such disrespect. I've had enough." Clara shifted in her seat, her voice trembling as she tried to step in, her words soft, pleading. "Mom, this isn't you. Ben's just being a kid. He doesn't mean anything by it." Helen's gaze turned to her daughter, firm but sorrowful. "Clara, it's not just this one comment. It's everything. Everything I've let slide for years. He's been disrespecting me, disrespecting you, disrespecting this family, and I've let it go because I didn't want to cause trouble. But not anymore. Not this time." David, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward, his face a mask of concern. "Helen, I think you're overreacting. He's young, he doesn't understand. He's always been like this. You know that." "Exactly," Helen snapped, her voice rising, but she quickly reined it in. "And that's the problem. You all let him get away with it, and I've let him get away with it. But that ends now." She looked at Ben, locking eyes with him, her voice steady and unwavering. "If you want to be a part of this family, Ben, you need to show respect. And if you can't do that, then you need to leave. The words hung in the air, a thunderclap of finality that seemed to echo through the house. Ben's face went from smugness to confusion, then to a flash of anger. "You're kicking me out?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Are you serious? I live here. This is my house too." Helen remained unshaken. "No, Ben. It's my house, and I'm done putting everyone else's needs before my own. If you can't respect that, then you can't stay here." There was a long silence. Ben's mouth opened and closed as he searched for words, but none came. The anger was there, simmering in his chest, but something else too, something close to fear. Clara, her face a mixture of disbelief and panic, stood up. "Mom, you can't do this. He's family. You're going to throw your own grandson out?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, but she didn't move, didn't try to touch Ben or intervene. She was too stunned by her mother's resolve. Helen stood slowly, her hand gripping the back of her chair for support, but the weight in her heart felt light, almost freeing. "Yes, Clara, I am. And if he's not willing to change, if he's not willing to respect this family, then it's time he faced the consequences." She took another deep breath, locking eyes with Clara, then with Ben. "He will be served with an eviction notice." The words were simple, but they hit like a punch. Ben's eyes went wide, a mix of rage and disbelief flashing across his face. "You can't be serious," he said through clenched teeth. Helen didn't flinch. "I am, Ben. I am." Clara's face twisted in disbelief, her voice a fragile thread. "Mom, please, don't do this. You can't." But Helen was done explaining. She had spoken her truth, and nothing, not even Clara's pleas, would make her turn back. Ben's jaw clenched, and his fists tightened at his sides. He looked like he wanted to shout, to argue, to explode. But instead, he stood there, silent, his anger hanging in the air, and for the first time, Helen could see the reality of what she had done, what she was willing to do. She had taken the first step toward her own peace. And there was no turning back. The weight of the decision hung heavily in the air the following morning. Helen sat at her kitchen table, staring at the phone in her hands, her fingers tapping the cool surface, as if the movement could steady her nerves. The air was thick with stillness, save for the occasional creak of the house settling, the faint rustling of the wind outside. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity, like a storm had passed, leaving the horizon clearer, if not yet calm. She took a deep breath and dialed the number she had kept in her contacts for years, but had rarely used outside of the routine paperwork she didn't want to deal with. John Parker, the family lawyer. The voice on the other end answered almost immediately, sharp and professional, just as it always had been. "Good morning, Helen. What can I do for you today?" She swallowed hard. "John, I need your help. It's about Ben. I want to start the eviction process." The words came out with surprising ease, as if they had been waiting on her lips for days, maybe even years. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She had made her decision, and now there was no going back. There was a brief silence on the line. Then John's voice softened, his tone almost cautious. "Helen, are you sure about this? You know that once we start, there's no turning back. It's a legal process that will be hard on everyone." Helen clenched her fist on the table, her nails digging into her palm. The physical pain of her grip grounded her. "Yes, John, I'm sure. I've been accommodating him for too long. He doesn't respect me, and I can't keep letting it slide. He needs to learn that there are consequences." John sighed. "Understood. I'll prepare the paperwork. You'll need to provide some documentation. Proof of his residence, a written record of the previous warnings or attempts to resolve things. I'll get the eviction notice ready." Helen's heart settled a little with his words. There was a part of her that felt liberated by the idea, as though she were stepping out from under a shadow she hadn't realized she'd been living in. Ben's entitlement, his disregard for her time and effort, had infected every corner of her home. It had made her question her worth, made her feel invisible. But now, as she spoke to John, a sense of power began to rise in her chest. "I'll get everything to you today," she said, her voice steady. "All right," John replied. "We'll take it from here." Helen hung up the phone, the sudden quietness of the house feeling almost foreign to her. She had never thought it would come to this, not in a million years. Ben had been her grandson, someone she had doted on, someone she had poured years of love into. And now, the bond between them was severed, not by distance or neglect, but by the sheer weight of her decision. Her mind wandered back to the dinner table, to that final confrontation. She had spoken with such conviction, such clarity. It was like a dam had broken inside her, and she had let the flood of years of hurt and frustration pour out all at once, and now she was taking the next step. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Helen looked up to find Clara standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her expression wary, as though she knew the conversation that was about to unfold. The tension that had been simmering between them since the dinner was now tangible, thick enough to cut through. "Mom," Clara said quietly, stepping into the room. I talked to Ben last night. He's furious. You know he's not going to take this well, right?" Helen looked up at her daughter, her eyes unwavering. She had expected this. Of course Clara would be upset. This was her son, her flesh and blood. And Helen, her own mother, had just made a decision that could shatter everything they had known. "I'm not doing this to hurt anyone, Clara," Helen said, her voice softer now, though still firm. "But I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. He's been disrespectful, and I've let it go. I won't do that anymore." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her voice trembling. "Mom, please. You're my mother. I don't want to lose you over this. Ben he's difficult, yes, but he's family. He's not some stranger you can just throw out." Helen felt a pang in her chest, a sadness that she had hoped would stay buried. She wanted to reach out to her daughter, to reassure her that this wasn't easy, but she couldn't back down now. She had to be firm, for herself. "I've spent my whole life making compromises, Clara. I've made them for you, for Ben, for everyone. But now it's my turn. I have to stand up for myself." Clara took a step back, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around her own arms. "But this isn't just about you, Mom. It's about all of us. This will destroy the family." Helen shook her head, her eyes never leaving Clara's. "The family was already broken, Clara. I've just finally accepted it." Clara stood there, silent, a mix of disbelief and sorrow on her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the clock ticking in the background was the only thing that filled the space between them. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice quiet but full of weight. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom." Helen's heart ached at the words, but she couldn't let herself waver. "I don't either," she said softly. "But this is the only way forward for me. I've been invisible for far too long." Clara didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Helen alone once more. As Helen sat there, the phone buzzing in her hand, she realized something that she hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just about Ben or even the family. It was about her, about finally reclaiming her life, her space, her peace. And as she looked down at the phone screen, the name of her lawyer flashing in front of her, she knew that this decision, painful as it was the beginning of something new. The door was closing behind her, but it was also opening ahead. The weight of years of compromise was lifting, and for the first time in a long time, Helen felt the thrilling, terrifying weight of freedom. There was no turning back. The morning light filtered through the curtains, bathing the kitchen in a soft, golden hue. The house was quieter today, the usual hum of activity muffled by the heavy weight of what was to come. Helen sat at the kitchen table, a single envelope in front of her. It was crisp, official, the words "Eviction Notice" printed across the front in bold, cold type. Her hand hovered over it for a moment, her fingers grazing the edge, before she picked it up and slid it into her bag. There was no turning back now. Ben had been downstairs for the past few hours, moving about the house in his usual manner, taking things for granted, acting as if nothing had changed. Helen, however, was changed. The woman who had once tolerated his mockery, his disrespect, had disappeared, replaced by someone resolute and unwavering. The thought of serving him the eviction letter made her heart pound, but it also filled her with something else. Something fierce, almost exhilarating. She stood up, pushing the chair back, and walked toward the living room. Ben was slouched on the couch, scrolling through his phone with an air of entitlement, completely oblivious to what was about to unfold. His presence in her home felt too large, too heavy, like an uninvited guest who had overstayed his welcome. "Ben," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." He didn't look up at first. He was too absorbed in his screen. But when she didn't move, when she just stood there in front of him, he finally glanced up, his expression dismissive. "What now, Grandma? I'm busy." Helen's eyes narrowed slightly, and she set the envelope down on the coffee table between them, its contents heavy with finality. She could see the confusion flicker across Ben's face, his eyes scanning the envelope before returning to hers. "Pick it up, Ben," Helen said quietly. He sat up straighter, his expression hardening as he reached forward, tearing open the envelope with a sense of disbelief. As soon as he read the first line, his face shifted from confusion to shock, and then to anger. "What the hell is this?" he spat, standing up abruptly. "You're kicking me out?" Helen remained calm, her heart thundering in her chest but her voice unwavering. "Yes, Ben. Your behavior has consequences. This is the price you have to pay for treating me and this family with such disrespect." Ben's face twisted in rage, the color rising in his cheeks. "Are you serious?" He stepped forward, the accusation in his voice cutting through the air. "You're throwing me out over a stupid comment? This is my home too. You can't just—" "I can," Helen interrupted, her voice low but filled with a quiet power. "This is my house, Ben, and you've taken advantage of my generosity for too long. I've tolerated your attitude, your laziness, your disrespect for everyone in this family, and I'm done." Ben's fists clenched at his sides, his voice rising with each word. "This is bullshit, Grandma. You can't just take everything from me like this. I've got nowhere else to go." Helen felt a pang of something, regret perhaps, but only fleeting. The years of letting him walk all over her were over. She wasn't the person she had been. "I'm not taking everything from you. I'm giving you a lesson you clearly need to learn. Respect is earned, and you've lost that." Ben let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You're so damn cruel. You're just a bitter old woman who wants to control everything. You think this is going to teach me something? You're just punishing me." Helen's hand trembled slightly, but she kept her composure, meeting his anger with quiet strength. "I'm not punishing you, Ben. I'm teaching you how to live with consequences. I've let you take me for granted, and I'm not doing it anymore." He glared at her, his eyes burning with fury, but she stood her ground, unmoving. This was not the time for apologies or explanations. There was no room for bargaining. As he paced in front of her, his voice growing louder, a final plea escaped him. "You're my grandmother. You're supposed to love me, not throw me out like I'm nothing." Helen's expression softened for just a fraction of a second, but her resolve didn't waver. "I do love you, Ben. But love isn't enough when it's one-sided. You don't get to keep disrespecting me and expect that everything will stay the same." Ben's jaw tightened as he absorbed the weight of her words. He took a step toward the door, His fists clenched, and for a moment, Helen thought he might lash out. But instead, he stopped, his back to her, and muttered, "You'll regret this. You'll see." Helen stood there, watching him, her heart heavy but strong. She had made her choice, and nothing was going to change it. The door slammed behind him with a finality that rang through the house. It was as if a door had closed not only on Ben's presence but on the past as well. The past of passive acceptance, of swallowing hurt and resentment. Clara had been standing at the top of the stairs, watching the exchange from the landing. She descended slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Mom," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You really did it." Helen nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped them on her skirt. "I had to, Clara. He needed to understand that there are consequences, and I need to start living for myself." Clara stepped closer, her voice faltering. "But what if he can't come back from this? What if this really breaks him?" Helen sighed, her heart heavy but her gaze steady. "That's something he'll have to figure out for himself. I can't carry that weight anymore." The silence between them was thick, the weight of Helen's decision hanging in the air like a heavy mist. But for the first time in a long while, she felt lighter, as if the chains that had bound her had finally been broken. There was no turning back now. The door was closed, and the future, her future, was waiting. The phone rang in the quiet of the afternoon, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness of the house. Helen knew exactly who it was before she even looked at the screen. Clara. Her daughter had been silent ever since Ben had stormed out, and Helen had braced herself for this conversation. She took a steadying breath and answered, "Hello? Mom, what the hell did you do?" Clara's voice came through the line, sharp and furious, but with an underlying edge of disbelief. "You really kicked him out? You've ruined everything." Helen leaned against the counter, her grip tightening on the phone. "Clara, I did what I had to do. I've explained myself. Ben needed to learn a lesson, and he's not going to get it if I just keep making excuses for him." "Excuses?" Clara snapped. "This isn't about excuses, Mom. This is about family, about what's right. Ben is a mess right now, yes, but he's family. You don't just throw him out on the streets because of a stupid argument." Helen closed her eyes, feeling the heat of Clara's anger roll through the line. "I didn't do it because of one argument, Clara. This has been building for years. I've let him walk all over me, I've let him disrespect everyone, and I'm not doing it anymore." "I know he's difficult, Mom," Clara said, her voice cracking. "But this isn't the way to handle it. You're making a huge mistake. He's going to hate you for this." A sharp pang of guilt jabbed at Helen, but she steadied herself. "Clara, I can't live like this anymore. I've been tiptoeing around him for too long, trying to keep the peace. I've lost my peace in the process. I've let him treat me like I don't matter. I can't do that anymore. Don't you get it?" Clara's voice broke, a sob slipping out. "He's your grandson, Mom. He's still just a kid. And you're making him feel like he doesn't belong here, like he's a burden. This is going to tear the family apart." Helen's chest tightened at Clara's words, the pain of her daughter's disappointment sinking deep. She had known it would come to this, but hearing it in Clara's voice, feeling that sting of betrayal, made it all the more real. She hadn't expected it to feel like this. The loneliness that had been building in her over the past days started to creep in, a shadow she couldn't shake. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Helen said softly, her words firm despite the ache in her heart. "But I'm not sorry for what I did. I can't keep sacrificing myself, Clara. I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself anymore." There was a long silence, and Helen could feel the chasm widening between them. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "You're wrong, Mom. I don't know how you think this is going to end, but it's going to destroy everything. Before Helen could respond, Clara hung up. The line went dead, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Helen stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand, the weight of her daughter's words crashing over her. It's going to destroy everything. Helen sank into the chair at the kitchen table, her hand gripping the edge as if it might hold her up. The air felt thick. The house suddenly too quiet. She hadn't expected Clara to react this way. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but hearing her daughter's anger, her sense of betrayal, it made her question whether she had made the right decision. Minutes later, the doorbell rang. Helen got up slowly, her movements heavy, as if each step carried the weight of the world. She opened the door to find David standing there, his face a mixture of concern and frustration. "You've got some nerve, Helen," David said before she could speak, his voice tight with emotion. "You couldn't even give him another chance? You really think this is going to work? You've broken this family in two." Helen looked at her son-in-law, her heart sinking. "David, I don't expect you to understand, but I can't keep making excuses for him. He's hurt me too many times, and I'm done letting him walk all over me." David's jaw tightened as he shook his head. "It's not about letting him walk all over you, Helen. It's about family, about forgiving. You think throwing him out is going to teach him something? All it's going to do is make him hate you." Helen shook her head slowly, her voice low but steady. "He's already resentful, David. He's already angry. He's been taking advantage of this family, using us for what he can get. And I'm done. I've spent my whole life compromising, trying to keep the peace. And where has it gotten me?" David's face softened, his shoulders slumping with the weight of his own emotions. "But this isn't the way. I don't know how you think things will be better after this. I don't know what you're hoping for." Helen exhaled slowly, her mind made up, her resolve stronger than it had ever been. "I'm hoping for peace, David. I'm hoping for peace. And if that means Ben has to learn the hard way, then so be it." David stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for some sign of doubt. But there was none. Helen's gaze was unwavering, her voice firm and resolute. Finally, David turned, shaking his head. "I don't agree with you, Helen, but this is your choice." He didn't wait for a reply before he walked away, leaving Helen standing in the doorway, her heart heavier than ever. For a brief moment she felt completely isolated, like the walls of her own home had turned into barriers, shutting her off from the people she loved. It was as if every connection she had was slipping through her fingers, crumbling under the weight of her decisions. But then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Angela. "You did the right thing. He'll thank you later. Don't let them make you doubt yourself." Helen closed her eyes, the warmth of her friend's words wrapping around her like a blanket. Angela was the only one who understood, the only one who had been in her corner through it all. She wasn't alone, not completely. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed Ben's eviction were a strange blend of silence and relief. The house, once filled with tension, now breathed with a quiet calm. Helen sat at the kitchen table one morning, sipping her coffee, her eyes lost in thought as the sun streamed through the window. She had never realized how much noise Ben's presence had created, not just in the house, but in her life. His absence wasn't just physical. It was a weight lifted, a space cleared, and Helen was learning to appreciate the stillness. She hadn't expected the house to feel so empty, though. Without the constant bickering, the slamming doors, or Ben's half-hearted attempts at charm, the quiet was almost too much to bear. She had always been someone who thrived in the bustle of family, always putting others first. But now, as she sat in the peace she had fought for, there was a part of her that felt a pang of something. Loneliness, perhaps, but also the sweet taste of freedom. The phone rang one afternoon, cutting through the quiet. Helen knew it was Clara before she even picked up. "Mom, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," Clara said, her voice strained. "Ben is. He's struggling. He's not doing well. He doesn't have a place to stay, and he's too proud to ask for help." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, listening to her daughter's words. She could hear the worry in Clara's voice, the guilt she was trying to hide. She knew it wasn't easy for her, watching her son flounder, knowing that Helen had been the one to force him into this situation. But she also knew that it was a long time coming. "Clara, you have to understand," Helen said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet authority. "Ben has to learn to stand on his own 2 feet. I couldn't keep enabling him, letting him treat us all like this." "I know," Clara replied softly, her voice tinged with frustration. "But he's lost, Mom. And now I don't know what to do. He's not the same. He's angry all the time." Helen took a deep breath, trying to ground herself. She had made her decision, and she wasn't going to let guilt sway her now. "I know this is hard for you, Clara, but this is the lesson he needs to learn. He has to face the consequences of his actions." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Helen could hear Clara struggling with her emotions. Finally, she spoke, her voice small. "I just don't know if I can watch him fall apart, Mom." Helen's heart clenched at the pain in her daughter's words. She had always been the one to hold the family together, to fix things, to take care of everyone. But this was different. This time, she had to let go. "I'm not asking you to fix him," Helen said softly. "I'm asking you to let him figure this out for himself. Sometimes, people need to hit rock bottom before they can rise." After a long silence, Clara finally whispered, I don't know if he'll ever come back from this, Mom." Helen didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window, watching the leaves sway in the breeze. The decision she had made still felt right, but the cost, the emotional toll, was something she wasn't sure she'd fully grasped until now. As the days passed, Helen found herself settling into a routine she hadn't realized she'd been craving. She spent her mornings walking in the park, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the sunlight on her face. She'd pick up books she had long neglected, read things she hadn't made time for. She picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years, creating small pieces of art that felt like a reclamation of herself. It was as if, in clearing out the space Ben had occupied, she was finally able to breathe. Meanwhile, Ben's absence loomed over her thoughts in moments of stillness, but not in the way it used to. She thought about him less and less, as she focused more on her own well-being. She wasn't sure how he was doing. He hadn't reached out to her, and part of her was thankful for that. She needed the space. But then there were moments when she found herself wondering if he had learned anything at all. One evening, a few days later, Clara stopped by with David. They sat at the kitchen table, their faces drawn with exhaustion. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was different now. Less about Ben and more about the walls that had slowly been building between them. "How's Ben doing?" Helen asked, trying to break the silence. Clara looked at David before responding, her voice subdued. He's crashing at a friend's place for now. He's still too proud to come back. He's not talking to any of us." David, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Maybe this wasn't the right way, Helen. Maybe Ben just needed more time to figure things out on his own. You pushed him too hard." Helen felt a flicker of irritation rise within her, but she kept her voice steady. "Maybe I did push him too hard. But what you're not understanding is that this was the only way he would ever learn. I've been the one to smooth things over for years, David." "And where did it get us?" The room fell silent, and for a moment, Helen could feel the weight of the years of tension between her and her family. But then, Clara spoke again, her voice quiet but sincere. "I understand, Mom. I really do. I don't want to lose you over this. Helen's heart softened at her daughter's words, but her resolve remained strong. You won't lose me, Clara. I'm still your mother, but I'm not going to be anyone's doormat anymore. I've spent my whole life making others happy, putting them first. Now it's time to put myself first. There was a long pause, and then David sighed. I guess we'll just have to live with it then. Helen nodded, but she felt a sense of peace settle within her. There was no turning back now. The consequences had been set in motion, and although the road ahead might be difficult, she knew she had made the right choice. For the first time in a long time, Helen felt strong enough to live her life on her terms. And no matter how hard the consequences were for Ben, for Clara, for David, she would no longer allow herself to be the one who always took the burden. The path forward was uncertain, but for Helen, it was hers to walk. The phone rang in the early evening, its chime sharp and unsettling in the quiet of Helen's house. She had just finished dinner, the remnants of her meal still on the table. She didn't even look at the caller ID before she picked it up. She already knew. The sound of Ben's voice came through the line, soft but strained, carrying a note of something Helen hadn't heard from him in a long time: regret. Grandma, it's me, Ben. Helen's chest tightened at the sound of his voice, but she remained silent, giving him space to speak. Her hand gripped the edge of the counter as she stood in the kitchen, the evening sun casting long shadows on the floor. I know I've messed up, Ben continued, his words stumbling out, as if he weren't used to apologizing. I've been an asshole, and I don't know where to start, but I'm sorry. I should have never treated you like that. You didn't deserve it. Helen took a slow breath, her heart conflicted. This was the apology she had waited for, yet hearing it now felt almost surreal. The Ben who had mocked her, belittled her, and taken her kindness for granted. He was speaking to her, as though he understood the weight of his actions. And yet, Helen knew that words alone didn't erase the damage done. She remained silent for a moment, letting him continue, though she was already preparing herself for what came next. I've been staying with a friend, Ben added, his voice quieter now. I don't have a place to go, Grandma. I'm really sorry for everything. Can I come back? I'll change, I swear. I'll do better. I don't know where else to go. Helen's breath caught in her throat, the rawness of his plea hitting harder than she expected. She could hear the desperation in his voice, but there was something else there too, a recognition of his own failures. Still, she couldn't shake the doubts that had plagued her since the eviction. Had he really changed? Or was this just another attempt to manipulate her, to find a way back into her good graces? You want to come back? Helen finally said, her voice calm but firm. You think an apology is enough to undo everything that's happened? To undo the years of disrespect, Ben? I know it's not, Ben stammered, his voice cracking. But I'll prove it. I'll show you I can do better. I'll make it up to you, I swear. Just give me a chance. Helen stood there for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, the silence stretching between them. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this was the turning point, the moment Ben realized the weight of his actions. But Helen had lived long enough to know that words were easy, and actions were what truly mattered. I don't know, Ben, she said, her voice quiet now, her thoughts swirling. You've said this before. You've promised me before. But the truth is, I can't just take your word for it. Respect isn't something you can just ask for. It's something you have to earn. Ben was silent on the other end, the weight of her words settling in. Helen could almost hear him thinking, searching for a way to fix it all, but there was no magic solution, no easy fix. The damage had been done and she couldn't simply sweep it under the rug. "I need time," she continued, her voice softening slightly, though her resolve remained. "You need to prove to me that you're serious about changing. It's not just about saying the right things, Ben. You've had plenty of chances to make things right, and you've chosen to hurt me and this family over and over." "I will," he said quickly, his voice urgent now. "I swear I will. I've already started. I've been looking for a job, and I'm trying to get my life together. I just need you to trust me, Grandma." Helen's eyes closed for a moment, her hand tightening around the phone. Trust. That was the hardest part. Ben had betrayed that trust so many times before, and she wasn't sure how much of it was left to give. "I'm not saying no," Helen said, her voice steady, but with a hint of sadness. "But I'm not saying yes either. You need to show me, Ben. And if you truly want to come back into this family, you need to prove that you can respect it. You can't just show up and expect everything to go back to the way it was." Ben's voice trembled with emotion. "I will, Grandma. I'll prove it to you. I promise." Helen exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his words, but still unsure. She couldn't forgive him immediately. Forgiveness would come with time, if it came at all. "Fine," she said finally. "But you need to understand something. I'm not going to tolerate any more disrespect. Not from you, not from anyone. If you want to be part of this family again, you have to start by showing respect. Not just to me, but to everyone. And if you mess up again, I won't hesitate to make the hard choice." There was a long silence before Ben spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I understand. I won't mess up. I'll show you." Helen felt the tiniest stir of hope, but it was cautious, tentative. She wasn't ready to forgive him completely. Not yet. She needed to see his actions match his words. After they hung up, Helen stood in the kitchen for a long time, her thoughts racing. She felt something shift within her, but it wasn't a sense of relief or peace. It was more like the beginning of something. An opening, perhaps, but only just. Clara called a few minutes later, her voice full of hope. "Mom, did he call? Is he coming back?" Helen paused before answering, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "He called. He's sorry, but he has to prove he's changed. I'm not letting him back just because he says the right things." Clara's voice softened, a note of understanding in her words. "I know, Mom. I just hope he means it this time." Helen couldn't answer because she wasn't sure herself. She had made her decision to stand firm, but now, as the silence settled around her, she wondered if there was room for healing, and how long it would take to rebuild what had been broken. The first few days after Ben's apology felt like a fragile truce. The tension that had hung over the house for so long was still palpable, but now it was tempered by a strange, cautious hope. Ben had moved back in, just as he promised, and although his arrival was met with a mixture of quiet acceptance and unspoken resentment, he seemed determined to prove himself. The house, once brimming with his casual disrespect, now had a different energy. Helen noticed the small changes, the way he no longer slouched on the couch for hours, playing video games without offering to help with anything. Instead, he started waking up earlier, making coffee in the mornings without being asked. He even volunteered to take out the trash, something that had never occurred to him before. But as the days wore on, Helen couldn't shake her wariness. She watched him with the sharp, measured attention of someone who had been burned too many times to believe in a quick fix. Ben had promised before. He had apologized before. And yet, here he was again, asking for a chance to prove he had changed. But could she trust it? One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Helen observed Ben as he sat on the couch. He was talking to Clara, his tone respectful, even apologetic as he listened to her recount a story from her day. His usual dismissive edge was gone, replaced with a sincerity she hadn't heard in years. Clara laughed, and for a moment, Helen allowed herself to believe in the possibility of change. But the doubt crept back quickly. Was it real? Or was he simply playing the part, knowing what was expected of him? She couldn't afford to let her guard down just yet. Not when so much had been broken between them. The next morning, as Helen made her way to the kitchen, she found Ben at the counter, carefully chopping vegetables for breakfast. The sight caught her off guard. It was a simple act, but it was the kind of thing Ben would have never done before. His attitude had always been one of entitlement, assuming someone else would do the work for him. Now, here he was, making breakfast without a word of complaint, his focus entirely on the task at hand. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him quietly. He glanced up at her, his expression neutral, almost hesitant. "I figured I'd make something for the family today. Thought it might be nice." Helen didn't say anything immediately. She studied his face, the sincerity in his eyes. She had seen this before. Small gestures that looked like change but eventually faded. It was a pattern she knew well. "Good," she said simply, her voice steady but her mind racing. "Thank you." As the day passed, Ben's actions continued to mirror the same pattern. He did chores without being asked. He spent time with Clara, no longer retreating into his world of indifference. He even apologized again, this time not with the desperation of someone who just wanted back into the house, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew they had to rebuild the trust they had broken. It wasn't easy for Helen to let go of her suspicions, but something about Ben's new behavior, his consistent effort to contribute without being asked, began to crack the walls she had so carefully built around her heart. But the test wasn't over. Ben's actions needed to become the new normal. Helen couldn't afford to be swayed by 1 or 2 days of good behavior. She had to see if this was real, if he could truly change, or if he was simply playing a game. She wasn't about to be deceived again. The weeks passed, and Ben's behavior became less about trying to prove himself and more about simple, genuine respect. He no longer left his things lying around the house. When Clara needed help with something, he was there, without being prompted. Helen watched all of this, cautiously optimistic, but still holding on to the knowledge that time would tell. There were days when she felt the weight of the past lifting, when the house felt quieter, warmer. On those days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Ben was finally starting to understand the cost of his past actions. But there were other days when the old wounds resurfaced. When Ben made a careless comment or slipped back into old habits, Helen's heart would tighten, and the walls she had so carefully lowered would rise again. Trust, she knew, wasn't something that could be rebuilt in days or weeks. It took time, and even then, it was never guaranteed. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Ben made a joke, something lighthearted, and everyone laughed. Clara, David, even Helen. For a fleeting moment, everything felt normal. For the first time in a long time, there was no tension in the air, no unspoken resentment. It was as if the family had come together, in this simple moment, as though nothing had ever been broken. But Helen knew that healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't something you could simply move past. Every word, every action, was a test. It always would be. But as she looked at Ben, really looked at him, the young man who had once seemed so lost, she felt something shift deep inside her. She wasn't ready to fully forgive him yet. Not entirely. But she could see that he was trying, and that, for now, was enough. The road ahead was uncertain, but Helen felt something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of hope, fragile but present. She had made the hard choice, and now it was up to Ben to prove he could live up to it. And as for her, she was ready to see where it would lead. The weeks that followed Ben's return were a quiet, steady march of progress. The air in the house had shifted. It wasn't the explosive tension that had once simmered under the surface, but something more like the slow, cautious growth of new roots pushing through the soil, tentative but determined. Helen watched it all unfold with a mixture of hope and wariness, her heart slowly softening toward her grandson, but never completely letting go of the reservations that still lingered from years of hurt. Ben, for his part, seemed to genuinely want to change. He wasn't the young man who had come in with his usual air of entitlement, expecting everything to be handed to him. Instead, he was different, more thoughtful, more present. There were mornings when he would make breakfast without anyone asking, or weekends when he would offer to help Helen with odd jobs around the house. He wasn't perfect. There were moments when old habits slipped through, a sharp word or a careless action, but those moments were fewer and farther between. One evening, as Helen sat in the living room with a book, she looked up to find Ben standing in the doorway. He had a hesitant look on his face, like he was unsure if he was interrupting. For a second there was a flicker of the old Ben, the one who would barge into a room with no thought for anyone else. But this time, his eyes softened as he met her gaze, and he waited. "I wanted to say thanks, Grandma," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, "for giving me a chance. I know I've screwed up, but I'm trying. I'm really trying." Helen set the book down slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the cover. She studied him for a long moment, seeing the earnestness in his eyes, the kind of look that made her remember, not the boy who had mocked her, but the child she had once cared for so deeply. It was hard not to feel something in that moment, but she knew better than to let emotions drive her now. "I can see that," she replied, her voice steady, "and I appreciate it. But remember, Ben, respect isn't a one-time thing. It has to be earned. Every day." He nodded, his gaze not wavering. "I get it, I do. I'll keep working on it. I'll prove I'm worthy of the chance you've given me." It was small moments like this, moments of accountability, that gave Helen the courage to trust in the process, though not fully. She was still wary, still holding back part of herself, but she couldn't deny the small victories that were starting to add up. For the first time in a long time, Ben wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was showing it through his actions. As the weeks went on, Clara and David began to notice the change in Ben, too. At first, they had been skeptical, unsure if this was just another fleeting attempt to win back their favor. But slowly, as Ben continued to show up, helping with chores, engaging with the family in a way that felt less forced, more genuine, their skepticism began to melt. They saw it too. One afternoon, Clara called Helen. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about Ben," she said, her voice softer than it had been in weeks. "I think he's really trying. I know it's been hard for you to let go of everything, but I see the changes. Maybe you were right. Maybe he really is starting to get it." Helen sat down at the kitchen table, her hand tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She had always known Clara would come around, but hearing her admit that Ben was changing, felt like a weight lifting. "It's been hard for all of us," Helen replied. "But you're right. He's trying. And that's all I can ask for." David joined them later that evening, his voice less tense than it had been when he had first reacted to the eviction. He had always been the peacekeeper, and though it hadn't been easy for him to accept Helen's decision, he had started to see the positive changes in Ben. "You know," he said, glancing at Helen with a weary smile, "I think you did the right thing. I wasn't sure at first, but you were right. He needed a wake-up call." Helen felt a rush of warmth at his words. For the first time in a long while, she felt like the family was coming back together. Not in the way it had been, but in a healthier, more respectful version. The walls that had once divided them, the misunderstandings and disappointments, were starting to fade. But Helen knew it would take time, real time, for the rift to fully heal. She wasn't under any illusion that things would be perfect. That evening, after dinner, Helen and Ben sat in the living room, the room dimly lit by a soft lamp in the corner. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension between them. No undercurrent of anger or fear, just the quiet, shared space of two people trying to rebuild something. "I want to talk," Ben said, his voice tentative, but strong. "About everything. About how I treated you. I know I've hurt you, Grandma, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I need you to know, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I wanted to say it." Helen listened carefully, her heart feeling a quiet sense of relief. This wasn't the same apology he had given before. This was different, more grounded. "I've been waiting to hear that, Ben," she said softly. "But apologies are just words. What matters now is what you do. You're showing me, little by little, that you're willing to work for my trust. And that means something." Ben looked at her, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "I'll keep proving it. Every day." Helen nodded, her heart cautiously lightened. "I know you will. But just remember, respect doesn't come with conditions. It comes with actions." Ben met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no defiance in his eyes, only a quiet understanding of the weight of his words. As the days passed, the family began to heal. The wounds weren't gone, not yet, but they were beginning to close. There was no immediate fix, no quick resolution. But Helen knew this was the start of something new, a new chapter where respect, not resentment, was the foundation. And though the road ahead would be filled with challenges, she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The quiet hope that had started as a fragile truce was now beginning to feel like a promise that the road to reconciliation, though difficult, was worth it. The days after the conversation with Ben were quieter, softer. Helen had spent years letting things slide, but now the silence in her home was not filled with unspoken hurt. It was filled with peace. She had made her choice, and while it hadn't been easy, she finally felt the weight of years of compromise lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she could breathe freely. Helen continued to set boundaries. At first, the shifts felt small. A polite refusal to run errands that weren't hers to handle. A quiet insistence on having her own space when family came to visit. But each time she spoke up for herself, each time she made a choice that put her own peace first, the satisfaction was immediate. For so long, she had been the one who bent, who gave, who put others before herself, and the toll had been heavy. Now, she could feel the strength in saying no, the power of prioritizing herself. Ben, too, had learned to respect those boundaries. He no longer walked into her home with entitlement, expecting her to drop everything for him. He helped around the house without being asked, and more importantly, he no longer made her feel like she was a burden he was forced to tolerate. There was a new understanding between them, a quiet respect that didn't need to be spoken, but was felt. Ben had begun to realize that Helen's boundaries weren't a threat. They were an invitation to build something healthier. It wasn't always smooth. There were moments, like when he would forget to knock before entering her room, or when he would leave his shoes in the hallway again, and Helen would remind him with a steady, "Remember the boundaries, Ben," that she wouldn't waver. He would apologize, and the tension would dissipate. These were the small tests, the repeated moments that Helen had to manage with patience, but she saw them for what they were, signs that he was trying, that he was learning. Clara, too, began to see the power in Helen's strength. She had always been the peacemaker, often caught in the middle between Helen and Ben, unsure of how to navigate the shifting dynamics. But over time, she began to respect her mother's choices. At first, there was resistance. She missed the way things used to be, when she could rely on her mother to make the hard decisions, when Helen had been the one who kept the peace at all costs. But Clara watched as Helen started to put herself first and realized something that had eluded her for years. Self-respect didn't just benefit Helen, it benefited the entire family. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Clara spoke quietly, almost as if she were still testing the waters. "You know, Mom, I've been thinking. I don't always agree with how you handled things, but I can see now that setting boundaries isn't just about keeping people out. It's about giving yourself space to be who you are, to live the way you need to." Helen looked at her daughter, surprised by her words. There was a softness in Clara's eyes, a maturity that hadn't been there before. "It's been a long time coming, Clara," she said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "But I'm finally learning that I can't be the one who keeps everyone together if I'm falling apart. I have to take care of me first." Clara nodded, her gaze distant for a moment before she smiled softly. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I see you doing this, and it's changing things for all of us." Helen smiled back, a warmth filling her chest. She hadn't expected Clara to say that, and hearing it felt like a validation of everything she had been working toward. The road to this point hadn't been easy, but the peace she had fought for now felt real. David, too, had begun to see the value in Helen's strength. Though still largely passive in the family's dynamics, he had started to understand the importance of standing firm. Helen could see it in the small ways he responded. When he used to stay quiet in difficult conversations, now he offered his thoughts more often, and when things needed to be done, he didn't hesitate to help. He had always been the peacekeeper, but now there was a quiet strength in his actions as well. He was no longer content to let Helen carry the weight of everything alone. Helen's life, once filled with the endless give and take of family dynamics, was finally beginning to reflect her own needs and desires. She spent her mornings walking in the park, her afternoons reading and painting, things she had pushed aside for so long. She no longer felt like she was sacrificing parts of herself just to keep the family functioning. She was living for herself, and the sense of peace that came with that was more fulfilling than she could have imagined. The change wasn't just internal. Helen had begun to mentor others in her community, teaching them about the importance of setting boundaries and standing up for themselves. It was something she had never thought about before, but as she saw how her own life had transformed, she knew she had a responsibility to share what she had learned. She spoke at a local women's group one evening, her voice steady and confident as she shared her story, how she had spent years being the one who held everything together, and how the hardest lesson had been learning to let go and say no. She could see the women in the group listening, nodding, some with tears in their eyes. Helen knew that her journey, her decision to prioritize herself, wasn't just about her. It was about giving others the courage to do the same. And when she returned home that evening, after another successful group session, Ben was in the kitchen, making dinner. His first instinct was no longer to retreat to his room or look for a way out. He was part of this family, and he was trying to be the man Helen knew he could be. They exchanged a look, no words needed. And for the first time, Helen felt something like closure. The family wasn't perfect, but it was healing. The boundaries she had set for herself, for her peace, had given everyone the space to grow. And that, she realized, was all she needed to feel complete. Her journey was her own, but in setting those final boundaries, she had begun to give the people around her the freedom to live their own lives with respect too. And with that, Helen knew she had created something more valuable than she ever expected. Peace. Real, lasting peace. And for the first time in a long time, she was able to sit back and enjoy it, knowing that the road ahead, though uncertain, would be one she would walk on her terms. The days had softened into a rhythm that Helen hadn't known she was capable of finding. It wasn't perfection, not by any means, but it was peace. A peace she had carved out with her own hands, through years of silent endurance and quiet rebellion against the roles others had tried to assign her. Helen's life had shifted in ways she had once thought impossible, but it wasn't just her life that had changed. Her influence, her decisions, had rippled outward, touching those she loved in ways they couldn't have foreseen. One afternoon, as she stood before a group of women at a local community center, Helen spoke of the power of boundaries, her voice steady and sure. She had come to be seen as a mentor, a guide for those who had lived too long in the shadows of others' expectations, just as she had once done. As she looked out over the faces of the women in front of her, Helen realized how far she had come. The stories of her own struggle were now lessons for others, tools they could use to transform their own lives. "There is nothing wrong with saying no," she said, her voice resonating in the quiet room. "In fact, it's the most loving thing you can do. For yourself and for those around you. For years, I thought that my worth was tied to my ability to give and give until there was nothing left. But the truth is, when you don't prioritize your own needs, you're only teaching others that you don't matter." She could see the way her words sank in. Some of the women were nodding, some were wiping away quiet tears. It was these moments of shared understanding, that gave Helen a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. She had spent so long in the shadows of her own life, but now, by teaching others how to stand in their own light, she was creating something much bigger than herself. When she returned home that evening, she found Ben in the kitchen, preparing dinner, a small but meaningful act that had become a part of his new normal. His presence was no longer a burden to her. It wasn't always easy to let go of the past, but she could see how much he had changed. He was learning, slowly but surely, the value of responsibility, respect, and self-awareness. These were the gifts she had given him, not through words alone, but through the lessons she had lived and shared. As they sat down to dinner that night, Ben looked at her with something she hadn't seen in him before: genuine appreciation. There were no words, just a glance, but it was enough. They ate together in comfortable silence, the weight of past tensions now a distant memory. Helen had not only forgiven him, she had given him the tools to rebuild himself, and he was doing it, piece by piece. Her legacy wasn't just about what she had taught Ben, though. It was about what she had given to Clara and David as well. The changes in them were less visible, but no less profound. Clara, who had once been the peacekeeper, had begun to take more control of her own life. She set boundaries with her friends, her colleagues, and even with her mother. Helen could see how much more at ease Clara was now that she had learned to put herself first. It was a quiet transformation, but it was a solid one. David, too, had begun to find his voice. Though still reserved, he no longer shrank away when difficult decisions had to be made. The passive man who had once deferred to Helen's judgment was slowly becoming someone who offered his own thoughts, who stepped up when needed. It wasn't a radical shift, but it was a shift nonetheless. A step toward his own strength, inspired by the example Helen had set. Helen watched these changes unfold with a quiet pride. The family dynamic had been reshaped, not through grand gestures or loud proclamations, but through the steady commitment to living with integrity, with boundaries that protected and preserved the dignity of everyone involved. She had not only transformed her own life, but had given her children and her grandson the freedom to grow into their truest selves. The house was filled with a sense of contentment that had been foreign to Helen for so long. The small irritations, Ben forgetting to knock or leaving his shoes by the door, were just that. Small. They no longer felt like insurmountable problems. And even the moments of tension that came from time to time were dealt with more openly, more calmly. There was no longer the constant undercurrent of resentment that had once flowed beneath the surface. Helen's life had become a delicate balance, a balance she had fought hard to create. She had learned to say no without guilt, to step back and let others take responsibility for their own actions. She had learned that her peace was just as important as anyone else's, and in doing so, she had created an environment where everyone could thrive. As Helen sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had lived a life of compromise for so long, giving everything she had to others, expecting little in return. But now, as she looked at the family she had helped to heal, she knew that she had built something lasting. Her decisions had created ripples that had changed the trajectory of their lives. Her legacy wasn't just in the lessons she had taught, it was in the lives that had been reshaped by her courage to set boundaries, to say no, to prioritize herself without guilt. She had left a mark not just on her family, but on the community of women she had mentored. And as the wind whispered through the trees and the world outside settled into night, Helen knew that her peace, her strength, would continue to ripple outward for years to come. She had created something lasting, something that would live on even after she was gone, a legacy built on self-respect, love, and the quiet strength of knowing when to let go. And as she sat back, feeling the cool evening air on her skin, she felt the most profound sense of peace she had ever known. She had walked a long road, but it had been worth every step. The future, though unknown, was hers to shape. Helen had found a peace she hadn't even known she was searching for. It wasn't just the absence of conflict or the quiet after years of tension. It was the freedom of living life on her own terms, fully embracing each day as it came. The joy she had longed for was no longer something to chase. It was something she had created, piece by piece, by setting boundaries and reclaiming her space. The mornings were hers now. She woke up early, the first light of dawn filtering through the curtains, and took long walks in the park, breathing in the crisp air and feeling the weight of the years she had spent holding everything together melt away. For so long, Helen had been the pillar, the one who held the family up, quietly sacrificing pieces of herself along the way. But now, as she moved through her days, she felt lighter, unburdened, with every decision she made in her own favor. Ben had come a long way since that day Helen had drawn the line. He continued to show her respect, his gratitude sincere and deep. It wasn't always grand gestures, but in the little things, the way he asked if she needed help before just assuming, the way he listened now when she spoke, the way he took responsibility for his actions. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. There was no longer the boy who expected everything to be given to him. Instead, there was a young man who knew what it meant to earn respect, to honor those who had loved him enough to help him grow. Helen could see the change in him, and though it was slow, it was steadfast. The quiet dinners, the conversations that no longer carried the undercurrent of resentment, they were all signs of a deeper shift. Ben had come to understand that trust wasn't given easily, but it was something that could be rebuilt, one respectful act at a time. And Helen could now see that he was trying to rebuild it, brick by brick. Clara, too, had grown. Watching her mother, Helen, set boundaries had been a wake-up call for Clara. For years, she had taken the easy path of maintaining the peace, trying to avoid conflict at all costs. But as she watched Helen live a life that wasn't dictated by the needs and demands of others, Clara began to see the value in putting herself first. She didn't need to shrink in the shadow of others' expectations. She could take up space, and in doing so, she could help her family heal, not by sacrificing her own needs, but by teaching them to do the same. It wasn't just Helen who was evolving. The entire family was shifting towards something better. David, too, had started to find his voice in ways Helen had always hoped he would. Though still quiet in his own way, David no longer deferred to others without thought. He took a stronger stance in family decisions, and though it wasn't always loud or obvious, the subtle strength in his actions had begun to change the dynamic of the family. He was no longer the passive one who allowed things to happen. He was now part of the active process of creating a healthy, balanced family. Helen often reflected on how far they had come, how much had changed in so little time. The family she had once carried on her shoulders, silently suffering for them, was now a group of individuals who had each found their strength. It was a slow process, but Helen knew it was worth it. She spent her time now helping others find the strength she had found. The community she had built through the women's group she mentored was thriving. Women who once felt invisible now stood taller, using their voices and their strength to advocate for themselves and others. Helen spoke to them not as a teacher, but as a guide, sharing her journey, the lessons learned, the struggles overcome. She helped them see that setting boundaries wasn't a betrayal of love, but a necessity for creating meaningful relationships, one in which each person was valued equally. Her role as a mentor brought a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't anticipated. Giving others the courage to reclaim their own lives gave her a renewed sense of purpose. The quiet wisdom she had gained from her own experiences was something she now shared freely, and in doing so, she saw how her influence rippled outward, helping others take control of their lives, just as she had done. One evening, after another successful meeting with the group, Helen returned home to find Ben in the living room, finishing up his homework for his new job. His presence didn't overwhelm her anymore. It felt natural, like a part of her home that had finally taken its place. As she entered, he looked up, offering her a small smile, one that was full of genuine affection, no longer hiding behind defensiveness or shame. "Dinner's almost ready, Grandma," he said, and for the first time, it wasn't out of obligation, it was because he genuinely wanted to contribute. Helen smiled back, her heart warmed by the simple exchange. She had taught him something that was far more important than any lesson in the past. It was the lesson of living with integrity, the lesson of knowing when to step back and when to stand up for what you need. "Thank you, Ben," she said, her voice steady but full of meaning. "You've come a long way." He nodded, looking at her with a quiet sense of understanding. It wasn't just gratitude he felt. It was respect, the kind of respect that was earned over time. And Helen knew, in that moment, that she had done what she set out to do. She had given him the tools to rebuild his life, and in doing so, she had rebuilt her own. As they sat down to dinner, Clara and David joined them, the family gathering around the table, no longer bound by the chains of resentment but instead anchored in the quiet strength of shared respect. The peace that filled the room wasn't something that had been handed to them. It was something they had all earned, together. The future was still uncertain, but Helen had made her final decision. She had chosen peace, chosen strength, chosen to live for herself. And now, as the family sat together, the world outside seeming to pause in the quiet of the evening, Helen knew that this peace, this new chapter, was the greatest gift she had given herself. The legacy she had built was still unfolding, still rippling out into the world. But for now, it was enough. For the first time in a long time, Helen could rest, knowing that the life she had worked for, the one she had earned, was her own. And that, she realized, was exactly how it was meant to be. The days had slipped into a gentle rhythm, each one feeling like the soft unfolding of a dream Helen had dared not believe in for so long. For the first time in decades, her life was not ruled by the expectations of others or the weight of unspoken sacrifices. There was no constant push to keep the family together at the cost of her own peace. Now, her days were filled with quiet joy, simple pleasures that she had once thought she was too busy to enjoy. Mornings began with the soothing sounds of birds outside her window, the light breaking gently through the curtains. Helen took her time getting up, savoring the freedom of starting her day without hurry. She'd take walks along the familiar paths of the park, the stillness of the world around her settling into her soul. For so long, she had been the one who rushed to meet everyone's needs. Now she felt the calm of having finally met her own. At home, Ben had fully settled into the new dynamic. The transformation she had hoped for, though slow, had taken root. He was no longer a young man stumbling through life without responsibility, but someone who had learned the value of respect, not just for others, but for himself. There were no longer any awkward silences when she asked for help. When she walked into a room, he wasn't glued to his phone or the couch. Instead, he was engaged, present. Dinner times were no longer filled with tension or unspoken resentment. It was in the shared moments, the quiet exchanges between them, that Helen saw how far they had come. As they sat down at the table, there was a new energy, no longer the weight of unspoken apologies or guilt, but the warmth of mutual respect. Helen often thought back to how hard it had been to draw that line, how she had feared the loss of the very family she had spent her life holding together. But now, as she watched Ben help with dinner, no longer hiding behind his old habits, she knew the truth. She had not only saved herself, but she had given him the chance to finally grow into the man he was capable of becoming. Clara, too, had changed. The mother who once tiptoed around everyone's feelings now stood stronger in her own decisions. Helen noticed the subtle shift in the way Clara interacted with her, how she no longer tried to mediate or smooth over uncomfortable situations. Instead, she supported Helen's choices, respecting the strength her mother had shown. Clara no longer felt the need to be the family's peacekeeper. She was learning to prioritize herself too. David had followed suit. Though still reserved, he had grown more comfortable in his own voice. Helen noticed him taking initiative more often, offering suggestions in family discussions instead of simply agreeing with whoever spoke loudest. It was clear that her actions, her determination to stand firm, had quietly reshaped the entire family. They were beginning to see the value of living their lives on their own terms, not controlled by old patterns of sacrifice and self-neglect. On the evenings when the family gathered together, it felt different, lighter. There were no hidden tensions, no passive-aggressive comments or looks exchanged between them. It was, for the first time, a family that understood each other not just in words, but in actions. They respected each other's boundaries and needs. They were becoming the family Helen had always longed for, a family where love was shown through respect, not duty. Helen had also found a new purpose, one that was deeply fulfilling. Her mentoring had grown beyond just the women's group. It had become a passion, something that anchored her in a way she had never expected. She continued to teach others the lessons she had learned, how to set boundaries, how to honor themselves, how to say no without guilt. Each time she spoke at a meeting, each time she saw someone take her advice and thrive because of it, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just her family she had impacted, it was her entire community. Women who had once felt small, invisible, were now standing taller, speaking up for themselves, carving out spaces where they could be heard. Helen was helping to create a ripple of change, and it was fulfilling in a way that she hadn't known in her earlier life of quiet self-sacrifice. Despite her full days, she still made time for herself. She took quiet afternoons to sit with a book, to paint, to create. Helen had learned that rest was just as important as work, that peace wasn't something to wait for. It was something to be made. She no longer rushed through life, checking things off a list. She moved through her days with intention, savoring each moment, grateful for the peace she had earned. One evening, as Helen sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. She looked out over the life she had built. Her family, once fragmented, was now whole. They had learned to respect each other's space, to honor the boundaries that Helen had set. Her work, her mentorship, had created a legacy that would continue to inspire even after she was gone. The ripple of her strength, of her quiet resilience, had spread far beyond her home. She felt fulfilled, not because everything was perfect, but because she had done the work. She had shown up for herself. She had set boundaries, and in doing so, she had taught her family the value of respect, dignity, and love. She had created a space where they could all thrive. Helen knew that life was not about avoiding struggle, but about having the strength to face it with the wisdom gained through experience. The family had learned that the greatest asset she had was her strength, and it was an asset they could now draw from as they lived their own lives with integrity. As the evening settled into night, Helen closed her eyes and exhaled deeply, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The journey had been long, but every step had been worth it. She had built a life that was hers, one where peace, love, and respect were the foundation. The future, whatever it may hold, was hers to embrace, and she was ready to meet it, knowing she had earned it every step of the way. And for the first time in a long time, Helen felt the warmth of a true, lasting peace. The years had moved with the gentle pace of a river, flowing steadily forward, each day a small, quiet victory for Helen. Retirement had given her the freedom to explore new passions, but it had also given her something deeper, the space to be truly herself. She had spent so much of her life nurturing others, filling roles that weren't hers to carry, that now, with the weight of years of compromise lifted, she relished in the luxury of doing exactly what she wanted, when she wanted. There was no rush, no more silent sacrifices. Helen's mornings were hers to savor. She spent hours in the garden, tending to flowers she'd always dreamed of growing but never had the time for. The earth beneath her hands, the fresh air filling her lungs, felt like a return to something essential, something she had once lost. In her garden she had learned patience, watching as tiny seeds grew into lush blooms. Just like her life, each moment, each choice, had been a careful planting of something she now nurtured. Something beautiful, something lasting. She spent time with her friends too. Angela, as always, was a steady presence in her life, a friend who had supported her from the very beginning. Through the struggle, through the hard choices, they met often, their conversations a mix of laughter, reflection, and sometimes silence, just being in each other's company. Helen had also started offering mentorship to young women in her community. She didn't do it for accolades or praise, but because she felt called to. In guiding others, she had found her own joy, watching women break free from the same cages she had once been trapped in. But it wasn't just her work that had changed. It was her home. The dynamic between her and Ben had evolved in ways she had never expected. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. They had learned to build a relationship not based on guilt or expectations, but on mutual respect and understanding. The tension that had once existed between them was now a distant memory. When they spoke, it was with openness, without the weight of the past hanging over them. Ben had transformed from the angry, dismissive young man who had once been so unwilling to change into someone who was thoughtful, responsible, and, most importantly, self-aware. He still had moments when old habits crept in, when impatience or defensiveness threatened to surface. But now he recognized them for what they were. And he was learning how to handle them, how to apologize, how to make amends. Their conversations weren't always easy, but they were real. And for Helen, that was enough. She had given him the tools to change, and he was using them. Clara and David, too, had found their own peace with Helen's choices. Clara no longer fought her mother's decisions, no longer clung to the old patterns that had once caused so much tension. She respected Helen's wisdom, her strength, and though they sometimes disagreed, there was a newfound understanding between them. Clara had stopped trying to be the family's mediator, stopped trying to keep everyone happy at the cost of her own happiness. Instead, she embraced her own life, her own needs. It was a quiet rebellion, one that Helen had always known would come, but now, seeing it, made her proud of her daughter's growth. David had changed too. Though still quiet, he no longer shied away from making his voice heard. He had begun to contribute more to family conversations, taking a stand in ways that were small but significant. He had started to value his own opinions and contributions, just as Helen had always hoped he would. Their marriage had deepened, not because of grand gestures, but because of mutual respect and the understanding that they both had the right to live authentically. The family was stronger, not because they had forced things to fit, but because they had given each other space to grow. They had all learned, in their own ways, that love wasn't about sacrifices, but about respecting each other's autonomy. Helen had built a foundation where everyone could thrive, and she was living proof that boundaries didn't just protect. Sometimes they set you free. Even in her quieter moments, when she sat by herself in the garden or with a book in hand, Helen felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew that her decisions, though hard, had shaped her life into something worth living. She had created peace, not just for herself, but for those she loved. And with that peace came a quiet joy, the joy of knowing that the future, though unknown, was hers to embrace, fully. She had spent so much of her life giving, sacrificing, smoothing over the cracks for the sake of others' happiness. But now she had a life that was hers to shape, one that was built on her own terms, her own desires. She had reclaimed herself. And as she sat on the porch one evening, watching the world go by, the future stretched before her, vast and open, waiting to be explored. She was free, not just from the past, but from the roles others had tried to force on her. She had created the life she wanted, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. Helen stood at the edge of the future, knowing that her peace was worth every sacrifice.